can you comment at all about the topic of the Orion Wars? When did they begin? I'm not very familiar with this topic. Can you comment on it at all?
Yes, this lasted about half of your million years, yes? Devastating entire star system. Yours truly was also involved there, as were many other members of the Empire, as well as the Galactic Federation of whatever, yes? But it was not just battling light and the dark. There were many different factions with their own agendas, battling over conquest, not just their idea of conquering the star system, but the entire universe eventually, and their idea of which ideology, which governing style, as the Galactic Federation of whatever calls it freedom, but it's just their self-governing. We call it control and order. It's our self-governing. Which style would obsede, yes, in their idea of conquest of the universe. They're trying to push their agenda, we try to push ours, others try to push theirs. And eventually we almost devastate our entire groups, almost entire annihilation of not just different races, but entire species that went extinct, many planets that got blown up. Literally the worst war we've ever experienced, and trust us, this is quite something. Yes? Even the Empire called troops to retreat, which rarely happens. Very usually, no prisoners are taken and given, and very usually there's no retreat but fight until there is nobody left standing, or there is conquest. So, in this regard, there were losses were at great all sides, and we decided to have not a peace treaty, but an armistice at least between the Federation and the Empire, but it's also due to the case that on your planet, people started to wake up in their timeline was linked to this one. Yes?
How long ago did this war begin in terms of our years, Earth years?
Very different to say this from your understanding of timing. Most likely billions of years ago. But again, it's a one-term timeline you're currently exploring the radio frequency ranges in the linear sense. But there's also similar experience taking place in the Pleiades, another one on Sirius, and one on Lyra, where those different energies are trying to integrate each other in a different fashion. They all happen in different consecutive timelines. They can follow each other or happen simultaneously to the one you're currently on. And different outcomes and different starts happen to the same event depending on the timeline you tuned in. The run we're sharing right now is literally billions of years ago, but that's just because of the current frequency range you're asking from in your timeline, and we can elaborate further on different timelines and how they function if we have the time. Ironically.
Can you please provide a short history of the Orion Constellation before the Orion Wars, such as how old it is and which species are native to it and any significant events?
Short history. Well, shall we start with the construction of the system?
Yes. It was constructed?
Well, star system more or less are always constructed, obviously not necessarily like your moon that's being pulled as a ship into your orbit, not like that, that's not what we're referring to. It was constructed by non-physical entities, not long after the advent of your modern day, what you're considering universal construction. When people like us, for example, were asked to come there, it was likely already to some degree established. So that makes it obviously at least a few million years old, of course, yes, from your own abilities, from your own way of reading before anybody settled in there. So for quite a while, it simply existed in a system before any life was ever settled, yes?
Okay.
After the universe was constructed, so we came there, or first people came there millions of years certainly after it was already constructed, and from what we're aware of, nobody else was there earlier. Our planet itself, stars itself, are living beings, so you could say there was already life there, but just because the stars itself are alive, and they also pull planetary bodies in their own orbits more or less consciously from their own consciousness, and then construct from their own. the Orion system here being no exceptions in this way that it was constructed. There are exceptions, but this was certainly not one of such. Now, in terms of time measurements, there are many different civilizations that existed in there for several billion of years, yes. Likely the first was one of ours, yes, what you might consider a reptilian nature, not necessarily what you might now consider Draconian, but more of an older lineage before it somewhat altered and created new reptilian structures that spread out. Also, our more modern settlements came much later in there. We had since vacated the system. Other more mammalian beings came in there that existed there for a couple of million years. Our non-humans, from what we're aware of, humans came much later. And then again, there was a resettlement of reptilian structures, mostly around the Rigel region, where we now still have some of our main bases. Yes.
Okay.
However, many of our culture, there was brought there certain buildings, certain building structures, which you might consider primitive in its outlook, but high-tech inside, certain things that in your eyes might look like a medieval castle, of course, but much bigger. Many of them were constructed on planetary bodies around the Rigel region. So, of course, we're referring mostly to our own civilizational structures. Of course, there's been others that we occupied after they had already been vacated, but also the reptilian nature that existed there. It was built a few million years after the construction of the system itself. From what we're aware of, the Rigel is one of the older stars, yes.
Okay.
Betelgeuse as well. There was also something like a trade route going on with the Draconian system in the beginning. For what we have no records, but that's not something KALASK was directly involved with. It's definitely one of the older systems form of habitational pull, where people were pulled to, were invited, so to speak, from the consciousness of the planetary bodies at a particular time. As we said, the stellar bodies invited the planetary bodies, so to speak, and then they became habitable to certain flora and fauna and slightly higher evolved species, such as ours.
Right.
Humans started settling later on. We're quite certain where they started exactly putting their feet on. There are certain regions that have now diplomatic high roots over there of both the Federation and the Empire, but for the most part it's still more the high ground of the Empire, not so much the Federation, even though where they also have some of their structures there.
Okay.
Just like we have some of our structures, for example, the Pleiadian region, which is not that old from what we're aware of. It was constructed later as a point of reference. We're obviously all talking about a certain timeline here, from which you're asking, as you're aware. If you're asking about higher dimensionality construction, where there's also something like a parallel universe, so to speak, yes, there is no time. So when you're asking when something was constructed something earlier than the other, that can sometimes be altered or stretched depending what timeline you're shifting to. You can literally construct a entirely new star system in a parallel timeline.
Right. So were there any wars fought here before the Orion Wars?
Yes, certainly. In the beginning, after reptilian species had left, there were numerous smaller groupings of a sectoid nature, something you might consider a warthog species that had larger groups, and the fringes of the Orion region that were somewhat warlike of a mammalian nature, obviously, and there was some fighting over territory, but that was also the third dimensional region. So one other primitive civilization that did not have much capacity of stellar travel. So some of them were easily obliterated, but they were obviously quite widespread before it happened.
What was the name of that group? Did you say it was the Vortag Reptilian group?
Warthog-like beings, mammalian groups. Like your animal on your planet, it's the warthog, yes?
I'm not familiar with that name. Do you know what the English spelling is?
A hawk, yes. WARTHOG,
Oh, I got you. Okay.
yes.
Okay, cool.
There was a conflict between those beings. The empires were quickly wiped out, yes. All around before we were employed there. We were later also establishing a certain center around the Reichel region that was taken over larger, older structures were built by earlier reptilian civilizations in the earlier adventures when our species first took a foothold on this stellar system.
I see. Do you know why many of the refugees from Lyra chose to settle in Orion? I mean, was it simply that they're close to each other, the star systems, or were there other reasons?
Yes, they were close, they were being chased, and therefore they decided to not travel too far, so to speak. Obviously, it's very far from your idea of counting distances, but for the capacities they had at a particular time, it was simply easier to jump there than, for example, yes, to travel to the Pleiadian region, yes, where some also went, yes, or Sirius.
Okay.
It was simply a high route, so to speak. Yes, a main connection. As there were also some that were portal jumping, as you're aware of what it is, yes.
Okay.
And there was simply an easy and fast connection. And they're being chased.
Right. So were the refugees welcomed by the native Orions?
Depends what you consider native Orions. There are again numerous civilizations that existed there for a longer period of what you call time. Those that are currently there were not many, yet they were not widespread. So there were some regions that were entirely vacated at the time, where formerly beings had been, so they could simply take them over that were empty at a particular point. Obviously, there were others in other regions. They were not that warm or welcoming particularly, but didn't care much because there was plenty of space, so to speak. However, there were also structures of the empire were being later constructed. Of course, they then again came in conflict with members of the Federation in this region, which then later on, for some degree, triggered the Orion War. But of course, there were many reasons for the Orion War starting. Territory certainly was being in the forefront. It was just a trigger point.
Right. So, do you know how easy or difficult it was for the refugees to adapt to these new planets? I mean, did they have to genetically re-engineer their bodies to be able to breathe in the new atmospheres and cope with the new bacteria and UV radiation and so on?
They survived easier than we thought. We thought their species was not as adaptable and it would be easier to wipe it out. Or they did have to make some alterations, obviously, but not to the degree that you might think, that they became a completely different race, that they might have changed their outlook entirely. It's just so their internal organ might have needed some enhancement. The ability to breathe the atmosphere was certainly altered, etc., etc. They helped themselves with certain technological means in the beginning and then later on with genetic alteration.
Okay.
Many of them died off in the beginning before they managed to do so. But we almost thought they would all die out, but they didn't. They quite flourished. Much to our original dismay, especially of the High Command currently.
I see. Okay, well, cool. That answers...
Like a virus that spreads everywhere. That's how humans were seen at a particular point in time, no offense. But at this point, you weren't even looked at as hairless monkeys, but rather as a virus. So you came a long way, so to speak, in our respect.
So, what happened during the first real battle between the Empire and Federation in the Orion Constellation?
Well, again, the current time frame for what you're asking, obviously a battleship of theirs fired is one of us because they felt threatened from what we're aware of now.
Okay. So what were some of the biggest and most important battles of the war like?
Well, it was an entire long battle, really. Planets being blown up was perhaps one of the most dramatic things when planets get destroyed for all sides involved. At one point, the sun blew up, that was likely the biggest. a supernova, right?
So what caused that to happen?
Weaponry which you don't have, which you don't have any access to, or an artificial sun, it basically got overloaded, right?
Okay.
Someone intentionally projected energy beam in the core of the sun and made it, well, overfunction, we don't have a better term.
Okay. Are you allowed to say which side?
Well, ours.
Okay.
It was a retaliation of the structure of the entire solar system had been taken over, so he basically pressed the reset button.
Okay. And so whenever there was this first original attack on an Imperial ship, what happened? Was it kind of like the ship was destroyed, and so the Empire came back in full force and attacked the Federation?
Well, obviously, it happens in battles. Yes, of course, some of our ships got destroyed, and we had to regroup.
Okay.
Not that surprising, because we are science fiction movies as well, right?
Right. So speaking of our science fiction movies, I mean, some people say that the war in the Star Wars movies is just a reflection of the Orion Wars. Do you know if that's right?
It's somewhat. Like many of your mythology or your modern art forms, right? Your fantasy, right? Is very often inspired by your mythology, and your mythology is very often inspired by real events.
Okay.
So if you read the Mahabharata, for example, there's also a lot of those battles detailed in there, right?
Uh-huh.
And obviously some of this could simply be a memory of some people, like a subconscious memory that comes up in their idea.
Right.
And they write it down, just like many in your so-called science fiction movements where all your artificial creations are aware of a reptilian species, right?
Right. So were there any space battles with ships firing lasers at each other like in our sci-fi movies?
Well, laser is somewhat different as a weaponry. It's not necessarily one beam traveled, it's more like one long beam, like a laser sword, basically. And yeah, we don't use laser swords, but it looks like such, and you can cut through ships like you can cut through butter with a knife.
Okay. Were there any dogfights between smaller ships like we had in our World Wars?
Not exactly like your Star Wars movie, as you might imagine, but yes.
Okay. Now, a lot of people today say a World War III on Earth would be over very quickly due to the existence of weapons of mass destruction. And whenever you told me that the war in Orion lasted 500,000 years, like this is what came to mind. Like how could it possibly last for so long without, one side getting the upper hand and it coming to a quick end? I mean, why did it last so long?
The same reason a war on New World would likely not involve very many nukes, because if some people used nukes immediately, the other side would see the futility of directions. So likely that's why you have a constant warrior planet without nukes, because it's what you consider conventional weaponry. For us, for example, we would not be willing to very quickly blow up a sun or planets, because that creates a ripple effect that is, well, there are certain laws where you can damage the non-physical, the blueprint basically, by damaging the creation, and vice versa, obviously much easier. You can also disintegrate an entire part of creation by just forming a black hole, basically, everything being sucked in, but you don't want to destroy your own property. You don't want to destroy your entire army, so you fight with more conventional weapons. Sometimes even you dock onto another ship, just fly into another ship without destroying the other ship completely, and then you jump off board pirate style and go at each other literally with claws, tools, and nails, you're calling such, or even with sabers at some time. Or a high-tech civilization, right? Because that's sometimes the only way not to destroy the entire ship. Of course, you could also annihilate the ship entirely, but then everything is gone. We want something on a ship, or you to free somebody. Well, we usually don't take prisoners, so therefore the other side doesn't either. But sometimes you want something not to be annihilated, for example, right? And very often it's just a base you want to take over and not completely fuck up. But our ships also have a self-destruct button as necessary.
Okay. So why is it sometimes called the Orion Wars, plural? Is it that like the wars started and stopped over time?
Well, certain regions were battling, then some other regions were battling. The Orion system is obviously a big system. It's not just a few planets.
Right.
So there was one Rigel, big years.
Okay. Uh, what was the general role of humans in the wars?
Mostly were slaves, cannon fodder, but some also fought on both sides. Well, if you consider humans, Harris might be formed not from Earth, but from other systems at least. Yes.
Okay. What role did artificial intelligence play?
A crate, on our side especially, was employed to create a crew who went amok at some point, so we had to retract, etc.
Okay. Uh, can you tell me how the KALASK race was involved? I mean, what were some of your general experiences in the Orion constellation?
Horrid. This first of all the Empire for the first and only time, again, from your perspective of time, you're right. Get a bloody most to the degree, and it was a sign about it's probably best to stop.
Okay.
Because otherwise we would have ended up literally destroying the entire system and everybody involved. We were mostly sent on as common troops to break battle groups up so others could enter, right? So we could get a foot in the door.
Okay. So what were some of the notable types of weaponry used during the wars?
Well, you already mentioned laser, there was scalar weapon involved. We literally mentioned sabers when the ship was docked. We of course had something you might consider guns or a scanner weapon, right?
Right.
A small beam that comes from something you can fire and cut through things, perhaps like you would imagine a laser sword, but again, just goes infinitely almost. Some ray guns or something similar, well, you would imagine to be ray guns, much faster, but it works with electromagnetism. Then, of course, there's something like an electromagnetic pulse weapon, yes, an EMP that just slays entire fleets and destroys their artificial intelligence, for example, but also the artificial intelligence of the ship, their computers, etc. Sometimes the weapon system, but then there is a backup option, etc., etc., it's back and forth. Normal cannons, right? Plasma cannons. You might see this from your science fiction idea. And very often it was simply scalar technology and one particular pulse that just travels through everything. It enters another dimension, then it travels through physical matter, and then re-enters the dimension while it has traveled through physical matter, and then it explodes.
Okay.
Alright? Therefore, it cannot be tracked in the physical. No radar or something so I can track it or stop it. It just goes through everything. There's nothing to stop it. Once it's flying, and it's gonna explode. Then you can only get away from the explosion, try to shield the explosion, but you cannot stop the weapon from reaching its target.
Okay.
Similar comes to some of your anti-tank weapons that bust a hole in the tank and then explode inside, right?
Right. So were any of the big Death Star type of weapons that you mentioned being used in the Lyra system, were those used in Orion?
Yes, certainly. Some of the planets employed there are similar to your moon, if you're referring to this, are obviously equipped with more weapon arsenal. Some of the larger ships literally look like planets, yes.
Okay. So I mean, these big Death Star type of weapons, did they look like they do in Star Wars, like where they're just big and spherical, like a moon, for example?
Similar to a moon, yes, but there were often actually hollowed out moons and not necessarily a half-finished ship. They were finished, obviously, right? They didn't look like a Colosseum, and they didn't literally look exactly like your Death Star from your movie, which is mostly also inspired by your moon.
Okay.
Especially by the Ceres also, for an obvious reason. Or those were very often also just hollowed out stellar bodies that you just found and tracked somewhere and equipped them.
Okay. So did they fire big lasers like in Star Wars?
Yes, and sometimes they also flew into things and they could be used like meteors.
Okay.
Well, attacking a planet, the smaller one at least. Kamikaze.
So the ones that fired like lasers are energy weapons. I mean, can you say a little bit what the science behind their destructive energy was, like how it was generated?
Well, they funneled energy from the nearest sun, right?
Okay.
And directed into a very dense laser beam.
Okay.
And it's just a very hot beam that just burns everything in its path.
Okay. So were they used by the Empire or the Federation or both?
Both.
Okay. Uh, were there ever any battles where spaceships managed to blow up any of these Death Stars?
Yes, certainly, of course. Some of them blew themselves up.
What do you
And
mean?
yes, we're when you're asking considering your movie idea, but in some cases of them, if they crashed into others, of course, they blew themselves up. Because again, the kamikaze idea, many of them were also had drone capability. Many of your smaller ships and your rascals in certain dogfight were drones,
Okay.
not manned, or reptile for that matter.
Okay. How many planets were blown up during the Orion Wars?
For me, we were around approximately 50, but we were not present when all of them got blown up. We were just present about 13 of them.
Okay. So did both
Take
sides?
or give. And both sides employed weaponry that destroyed them, yes, and again, some were destroyed by the same side that operated them.
Okay. So, like, about the end of the war, what was there any big final battle or event that forced an armistice, or was it just that the fighting gradually became smaller and less frequent?
Gradually, yes.
Okay.
It was, well, both sides are being simply worn out, like sitting in the trenches, so to speak, right?
Right.
And there was not one event, but more and more it became clearer to everybody involved that it was going nowhere, quite literally. And it also, when people approach a certain principle that earlier was mentioned already by the kitty cats, or even the Lucifer principle, right?
Right. Okay. So currently, is there any fighting in the Orion constellation?
Well, there's both skirmishes between different pirate groups, but it's not necessarily a big confrontation between two empires of any sorts.
Okay. Now, you said before that one reason for the armistice was that people on Earth started to wake up and our timeline was linked to the Orion one. Can you clarify what you meant exactly?
Well, obviously everything happens in conjunction. For your planet, similar ideas became known. For example, the whole idea of your descendancy, for other words, for example, your link up, etc., you reach a certain level of maturity, but then again, not one event influenced the other, but vice versa. So the energy shifted in both time zones, yes. Literally just not a time zone.
Okay.
To the same point of what in the Orion Constellation was something like an Armistice and certain interest, because both sides were somewhat involved with the creation of planets. We became interested again in this particular piece of rock. It just appeared. Well, the whole idea of creation is when one thing happens, it influences everything else, even if you aren't fully aware of. So if you break your ankle today, it can affect the entire planet. Or if you eat ice cream today, just two examples, positive and negative, right?
Right.
But not literally that anybody sees what happened and they think something different because of what they saw you. It's more the energy pulls out. Of course, a minute difference or massive wars or a reach of maturity of an entire planet has a certain effect.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Well, yeah.
So it's reflected back and forth, right? From one side to the other and vice versa.
Right.
Again, that's a good example why there is no time.
I got you. Somewhat.
So therefore, nothing can influence the other in timeline. It's just you get to a certain place, right? And therefore, you are in alignment with other events happening as well at this particular time. Because time is just a point in frequency, not an ongoing process. At a certain frequency, things just happen.
Right.
Were the Orion Wars fought throughout the entire universe, or just in Orion, or what?
Well, they're called the Orion Wars because they are from that region, but it spilled over from the other regions. So some had fled, were followed after, etc. but to most degree it took place there, but many beings from the entire, well, at least, yeah, the entire what you would consider known universe came there to fight.
Okay.
So many refugees fled from there to other regions, Blades, Syria, etc., and were attacked there as well, and some, well, retreated, came back, etc., but that was the main battleground.
Okay. Did the war include any kind of spiritual battling or whatever in non-physical dimensions?
The non-physical were involved, yes. It was for numerous dimensionalities, including, well, then that would spill over in what you would refer to as magic, yes? So some beings conjured up forces from the non-physical and used those to affect the physical. It's a normal form of battle, normal form of warfare. So therefore, the non-physical entities had an effect on the battle the same way, for example, extraterrestrials interfered, quite physical, however, on your planet Earth numerous times when there are battles in your ancient past. The same way some beings there called up on higher forces, so to speak, to interfere.
Okay. I know you can physically battle in the non-physical, but was there any kind of like spiritual battling?
Well, yes, as we just shared, the physical was influenced by the non-physical to create what was called upon, and energy was conjured up from the non-physical to affect the physical.
Okay.
Psychic warfare, if you will.
Okay.
They're quite adamant at that.
So, like, did the Draconian Empire have just one emperor throughout the entire war, or were there multiple ones?
At that point, for what we were aware, there was more or less a one-person dictatorship, but it was always some family that had control.
Okay.
A dynasty.
Right. Did the Empire have any allies who weren't an official part of the Empire?
Well, numerous beings of a reptilian nature are part of the Empire, somewhat adjacent to it. Allies, well, useful idiots, perhaps that's the correct term. We were able to subvert some of their strategies from other groupings, used them against themselves, etc. Some beings voluntarily cooperated, but then they were more or less always absorbed. That's the way the Empire works. So yes, there were some beings that were somewhat aligned, but not quite fully members, etc. Everybody fought more or less against everybody else, but to a large degree was the Empire against everyone else.
Okay. I mean, can you briefly describe what, like, the main few allies were in terms of what species they were or what their group was like?
Some turtle-like beings, well, not really, but the best way to describe it to you, were somewhat aligned. The arachnids were part of the larger empire at that point. And some beings that they are not very relatable to anything on your planet, insectoid perhaps to some degree, but not really. The Empire at that point was still mainly reptilian.
Okay.
Well, it still is mainly reptilian, but at that point was almost exclusively. The arachnid played a larger role over there.
Okay. Did every planet in Orion experience fighting, or were any neutral?
Yes, some try to be neutral, but just like in your wars, usually, especially your world wars, neutral countries get invaded simply because they have resources, and the one side invades before the other so they can use the resources or manpower, etc. In this case, simply an outpost, the planet is just an outpost to attack from there, or to store weaponry, etc. And then, of course, one country would try to be neutral, and in this case, the entire planet would try to be neutral, but then there's some form of collaboration with one side or the other, then that's being considered an act of war by the other side, and they get invaded, so ultimately there was war everywhere.
Okay. Can you say roughly how many populated planets existed in Orion at the beginning of the war?
Millions, at least.
Okay. Now, in terms of territorial changes throughout the war, was it kind of like each side held one large section of Orion and the fighting occurred at the front lines between these two sections, or was the fighting just basically scattered throughout the entire constellation simultaneously?
The latter mostly was, for the most part, was the case. In the beginning, there was more of a clear front line and very quickly tore up through covert actions to infiltration and to break up the enemy lines from behind, etc. Both sides did such, so therefore, sooner or later, there was both sides fighting everywhere.
Okay. Can you share any more details about the history of the fighting in the system that had its sun blown up? Like, why the Empire considered it so important that they had to retaliate so strongly for losing it?
Well, there are certain resources, right? And certain species on there were considered a bigger threat. There's also, well, lots of anger, right? So those outposts were fairly important.
Okay. So what exists in place of the sun now? Just a hole in existence?
A black hole.
Okay.
Some of them also stored offspring. Next generation.
You mean some of the planets that existed in the system before the sun was blown up?
Yes.
So what was so important about the next generation offspring?
Well, there was simply a next generation that would take over rulership, likely, or simply a breeding ground. And a lot of energy obviously being put into creating such an offspring.
Okay. I mean, I don't mean to go too much into inter-reptilian politics, but like, what was so? I still don't understand what was so significant about this generation. Like, why did they have to totally be destroyed?
Well, there could have been a certain threat.
To the entire war effort?
Yes.
Okay.
Super soldiers, whatever you would tell them now today, perhaps in your own species.
Okay. Were they reptilian or what?
They were an experiment.
Okay. So
To a large degree, yes.
okay. So, like, did the Orion Nebula have any significant role in the war?
Yes. To a large degree, it was formed or altered during the process.
How so? What do you mean?
It was weaponized.
So are you saying the Federation or the Empire created the nebula?
It was created during battle.
How?
The destruction of various planetary bodies, also from the non-physical.
But I mean, the nebula itself is like enormous. Like,
Yes,
so how did a few planets getting blown up create it?
it certainly wasn't a fear.
Okay. I mean, you're not giving many details, KALASK. Like, how did it form? How?
Yes, we're very aware. We're still browsing energy from your previous questions about the certain planetary bodies that were destroyed the solar system, and indeed it played a large role with suns being blown up, right?
Okay. So,
We're also having a problem translating some of the ideas to something that's somewhat understandable. Compression, right? Implosions, explosions of certain stars, right? You remember the formation of red dwarfs, right?
okay.
Like giants.
So which side created the nebula and why?
Both during battle.
You mean unintentionally?
Yes, well, there was another intention that didn't go as planned. The berries would probably disagree. Well, the idea being large decrees of planetary bodies were intentionally crashed into each other, right? Large were pulverized. Again, some of this also happened from another dimensionality where it was the attempt to change the physical through the non-physical, basically. Again, we're oversimplifying grossly because we don't find the correct words in the vessel's mind to make any sense of this whatsoever, because you simply don't have anything relatable. Planetary bodies, stars, especially were crushed, reformed, etc. So large will debris, like your asteroid belt, right? Being from a crashed planet. In this case, it being from pulverized solar systems.
So what was the intended what purpose did it serve to create this nebula?
Well, the purpose was first and foremost to create more of a wall, right? Like a wall in space, so to speak, correct? Which was weaponizable, like a Great Wall of China, for example, except third-dimensional, or rather fourth-dimensional in this case. And, well, it was to a large degree destroyed, or one part crashed into the other. Also, the overlay of another dimensionality from the non-physical didn't do it much well.
Okay. Interesting. So why does the nebula today create so many stars? Is that just a natural result of it?
Yes.
Okay. Do you care to guess roughly how many individuals were killed during the entire war?
Again, entire races were wiped out. At least billions.
Okay. Was it mostly combatants or civilians?
More civilians than combatants, but very likely into the trillions, if you count both.
Okay. And we talked about how there's only growth through strife and how war helps us evolve. Can you say what some of the main ways were in which the Empire grew and evolved during the war?
Well, we certainly learned we need to form alliances with other species more, right? To create more battlefront. Also the value of infiltration during war of enemy front lines, right? Also again the idea to shield better certain offspring. How important offspring in general would be in the next generation, etc., to make certain that they survive more than anything, the necessity to protect some part of the empire, since in this case two large parts were involved and we had nothing to fall back on, right? There was a new situation. Psychic warfare to a large degree was greatly enhanced because we were forced to become more adamant at it, which again, where you have the idea new weapons being developed usually during war. In this case, it was also to a large degree of psychic abilities.
Okay.
Also the willingness to blow up entire solar systems.
Okay.
On which there was previously hesitation.
Right. So today, are there monuments and memorials at the sites of past battlefields like we have at ours on Earth?
On our own world memorials, yes, not necessarily on those particular planets where the largest battles were, largely because things like the nebula were already created from those battles, and they are a testament themselves, naturally.
Okay. Do you know what the main goal was of the higher dimensional beings who organized the war?
We can only speak from our perspective, and those that were aligned with us obviously put us in there with the intention to harden us up and put us into the most obvious extreme form of war that was possible at the point, to see how we would strive. Our intention originally was to simply take over everything. It was quite traumatic that it didn't work out that way. But from their perspective, it was likely, or perhaps from our understanding, to put us sort of the test of how we would react if there was no way out. Again, from those that were guiding us along, those that were aligned with either side, we can only guess.
Okay. Do you foresee the universe ever having another war as great as either the Orion Wars or the Reptilian Avian War?
Well, you're asking time frame. There is certainly different wars happening in all time dimensionality, etc. So if it was possible at that point what you consider a past, then it is possible at a point what you would consider the future. Even bigger than such. It is even possible the entire physical universe would be annihilated. Everything's possible in that degree.
Okay, are you able to look into future time frames and see if any wars as big as either of these two are going on now?
Again, everything is possible. Same as when you're asking about your Earth's past, right? All of the options you think of are automatically possible, otherwise you couldn't think of such. So something like this, yes, is likely going on right now, but since this is the one we referred to, not one that we could access from our current existence, we are also always talking to a version of us that's somewhat conducive to your own frequency, and if you should transition to what you consider World War III, right, it would likely you would also be on a time frame where something like this would again then be possible out here. So it always depends from what version you're asking. So it's very possible that something like this is as big going on, but from our perspective currently, what we're asking, remember you are currently on Earth, in a certain year you consider a time frame, but in reality there is no time, so you're interacting with us in the version where your Orion War is the biggest war that happened.
Okay.
But if you shift over to the version again, likely the one on your world would be considered a world war, then likely there would be an equivalent up here, because you would be simply talking to a version of us that's more equipped for another warfare, and in a higher dimensionality, it would depend on what you would consider a bigger war. More people dying, more territory being involved, more species being involved, depends what you consider bigger or smaller.
Right.